Today, we're talking about equipment. What is it really? What's happening behind the scenes? How is it created? Why do we need so many details? Today, Alexander and Ivan will explain everything. Let's get straight to the point, guys. So why do you keep paying so much attention to these tiny details? Seams, different layers, and all these elements, knowing that most players might not even notice them or realize they're in the game at all.
I wouldn't say that this is unnecessary work. It's all visible one way or another. In the initial stage of item development, when we draw everything as textures, we pay a lot of attention to the seams. Let's take the seams on a sewn uniform. We focus more on drawing the traces of the seams, rather than individual threads with all their fibers and structures. We exaggerate those traces so that they can be seen on our textures. Let me show you an example. Here, we can take a closer look in Substance Painter. If we zoom in, you can see we've added some bump mapping, just moderate, to highlight the stitching of the elements. At this level of detail, it might not be visible, but in the bigger picture, it helps us refine the stitching and create subtle ridges on the seams. This creates the feeling that it's not a solid piece of fabric, but several pieces sewn together.
Do you think many players would pause, replay a scene, and zoom in to take a closer look at such details?
For cutscenes and gameplay, this level of effort is enough to make everything look cool.
Right. In cutscenes, we usually see footballers much closer, in more detail.
I can show you how this works and how we texture it. Here, we compare what we get during the texturing process versus what we see in the final output. At this point, we procedurally apply some tiling textures to make the fabric details more visible. We can zoom in to examine details on the collar, adjust the lighting, and see how it works. We're now looking at the optimized and compressed textures. If we zoom in really close, we'll of course see that the textures are optimized. But since we procedurally apply tiling materials, we still can see the difference in materials on the seams. All of this is done procedurally within Unreal Engine. This way, an object can be optimized for consoles. This allows us to improve FPS, reduce overall memory usage, and achieve better visuals.
What we see on the screen is a super smooth, unnaturally smooth uniform, but in the game it looks much more realistic. How does that work?
Let me show you. Let's say we have a model in a static, idle position with the fabric hanging. This is the engine layering effects. We can see both the procedural maps and some physics simulation. Let's have it run slowly so we can see everything clearly. Now, a little faster. Notice how everything is moving. Our procedural maps start blending together, and as a result, the folds begin to shift and flow smoothly across the body.
The way the light falls also plays a huge role, as I understand it.
Of course, one way or another, procedural maps catch light, and we can see this by rotating the model and seeing how it manifests. You can set it to a static pose, and then try moving these little cubes, and you'll see the folds changing. So we have predefined shapes that we've recorded and baked for specific positions of the shorts and jersey. For example, when we move the leg and the knee lifts, or when a player turns their torso, a fold is formed, and the procedural maps switch to make it easier for us.
I wonder what this white rectangle is doing here at the top of the screen.
This is the UV map for our uniform. It tells us which folds should be triggered by specific poses. We design everything in the game so that it's accessible not only to players with high-end hardware, but also to those with less powerful devices, so everyone can play properly. So, of course, for the most part, we use textures rather than volumetric meshes or 3D grids to reflect our smaller details. We can explore this further using balls as an example. So, what do we have here? An albedo texture, but we add various bump maps, normal maps, and interesting patterns to it. Overall, it doesn't become too resource-intensive. Yes, we are limited. If we rendered everything realistically with detailed geometry, the game would, unfortunately, consist solely of this single ball. Therefore, We rely on game-specific, widely accepted global pipelines and standards.
Guys, I know that people who work in this specific area of development always have a favorite item, something they enjoyed working on the most or are particularly proud of. In your case, especially since you focus more on design, do you have something like that?
I have several favorite items. Let me show you the uniform, which features certain references to African culture. I'm especially proud of the micro-patterns on the collar. I was also fascinated by working on the balls, adding visual complexity with micro-patterns, angles, and all those details that make an object look more or less realistic. On the uniform, we applied a similar approach, adding various micro and super micro patterns, introducing noise to the roughness, and increasing the overall complexity. However, we're now simplifying this process because tiling textures can better manage roughness and visual detail. Despite this, the design remains relevant and trendy, thanks to the large color blocks that seamlessly flow into each other. This technique highlights the identity, with the colors subtly blending into the gradients, reinforcing the overall design concept. When we started, we worked so hard on this. I remember when I started digging into it, figuring out how these balls display things like how many bars of pressure standard balls should have, their weight, and so on.